Thank you. So I will talk about the role of emotions and art for moral reflection on risky technologies. That's a very long title, a lot of words, lots of notions in there. Hopefully within the next hour I can elaborate on how all these notions, surprisingly mixed as they seem here, actually hang together and maybe even make sense. This artwork I would just like to introduce. It's by Patricia Piccinini, an Italian artist, and it's called The Young Family, and I think it beautifully illustrates some of the ideas I would like to elaborate on tonight. So most people see this artwork feel a variety of emotions, for example, disgust, or they're upset. What a gross image. Or they feel care or responsibility for these creatures. And these emotions that this artwork gives rise to, and which was actually also the intention of the artist to appeal to people's emotions, I claim that these emotions actually help us to critically think and deliberate and reflect on new potentially risky technologies, such as in this case, biotechnology, genetic modification, CRISPR-Cas, etc., human-animal hybrids, just to give an example. And I will have examples of more artworks that engage with risky technologies further on. But first, I would actually like to take a few steps back. And let's first bracket the artworks out and start with risk and emotion, which is already sounds like a very controversial combination. So decision-making about risky technologies is a very intricate matter that puzzles policymakers, engineers, scientists, social scientists, and also more and more philosophers. Of course, for I think a long time, most Anglophone philosophers have not been very much interested in technologies other than health-related technologies. But given the importance of technology for our world, for our societies, we believe at my philosophy group in TU Delft that we need philosophers to really reflect about these technologies and engage in critical ethical reflection about them. So one of the problems apparently with debates about risky technologies is that they're very emotional. Which often leads to stalemates between proponents and opponents of technology, which more or less coincides, but not completely, with stalemates between experts and lay people. Often experts assure society that a new technology is safe, but the public is often worried and concerned about these technologies. And experts tend to focus on low probabilities of something going wrong, whereas opponents or the greater public often focuses specifically on unacceptable outcomes. So what if something goes wrong, then the outcomes would be unacceptable, such as a nuclear meltdown, for example, or things going wrong with genetic modification. And an issue that puzzles a lot of people who work on risk is what to do with these emotions. Now, there are two main streams on how to deal with emotions and debates about risky technologies. And as I will argue in my talk, I think that these main approaches actually fail, practically, but also philosophically, morally speaking. So I actually think that lead to pitfalls in current risk politics because these approaches are based on the idea that emotions are irrational. So what are these two approaches? I broadly characterize them as what I call the technocratic pitfall and the populist pitfall, respectively. The technocratic pitfall bases risk policy and decision-making about risk solely on formal quantitative methods, such as risk cost-benefit analysis and formal models, for example, mathematical models. And it leaves out emotions, and so also the public, because the public is supposed to be irrational, or it only allows the public in to the extent that the public is willing to engage with these numbers and quantitative approaches. And a problem with that is that this can be seen as problematic in a democratic society where we would like to engage all stakeholders in decision making about these technologies. Then the other extreme is what I call the populist pitfall. So of course, nobody calls themselves a populist, and hardly anybody calls themselves a technocrat, so these are labels that I use, ideal types, as it were, of approaches. The populists say they agree with the technocrats in thinking that emotional responses by the public to risky technologies are irrational, but rather than banning the emotions from the debate as technocrats do, populists say, okay, the public is opposed to nuclear energy, shale gas extraction, genetic modification, whatever you have. Of course, these emotions, this opposition is grounded in emotions, and as we all know, emotions are irrational, but we live in a democracy, so we have to follow the will of the public. Sounds nice, right? We follow the will of the public. Well, the problem is that this is a very narrow understanding of democracy, because there's no real debate about values, moral considerations, etc. So basically, in both these approaches, there's no genuine democratic debate. Now, there are deliberative approaches to democracy, and also in the context of decision-making about technologies, so for example, participatory technology assessment approaches that do try to include values of the public, but these approaches also shy away from emotions because they're also grounded in a rationalist approach to moral thinking. Let's first zoom in on the technocratic approach in a bit more detail to analyze why it's philosophically problematic. So not only for the lack of democratic decision making, as I already mentioned, but also more substantially. So in the technocratic or quantitative approaches to risk, risk is defined usually as the probability times an unwanted effect. So for example, annual fatalities as the consequence of a technology. And then policymakers and other experts in this field use risk cost benefit analysis and formal models in order to decide whether a technology is implemented. And proponents of this kind of approach praise it as a rational, objective, and value-neutral approach. And I already put it within quotation marks and put question marks there, so rhetorically speaking, you can already see that I have some concerns. And indeed, a few years ago, I co-edited this handbook of risk theory with contributions from risk theorists from social sciences, philosophy, but also decision theory, mathematics, engineering. And there was broad consensus that this approach is actually very, very problematic. Why? Well, first, is this formula really value neutral? No, because obviously what is an unwanted effect already entails a value judgment. And for example, just considering annual fatalities at the expense, almost literally, to, for example, people who get long-term illnesses due to technology exposure to radioactive exposure, for example, that in itself is already a value judgment. Well, only dead people count. Even if you would include also injuries and long-term illness, etc., how to balance these compared to each other? And what's the value of a human life? A fundamental philosophical question. Also for our students, we use a little exercise where they use official tables by insurance companies where there's a value attached to human life and to injuries, and two different tables, both officially used, and depending on which table you use, you get totally opposed outcomes. And I once held a presentation about this at a not-to-be-named ministry in a not-to-be-named country, and the people there said, oh, we know that, we do that all the time. We know where we want to, which outcome we want to reach, and then we design the model that gives us the desired outcomes. So this supposedly neutral formula can be manipulated, and even if it's used with the best intentions, it does imply a value judgment. Also, for example, this formula, if it just focuses on human beings and leaves out nature, it also entails a value judgment about, for example, that nature only matters to the extent that it is beneficial for human beings, which is a controversial value judgment where we should have a debate about, which is not conducted. Then, of course, cost-benefit analysis. That's an approach that's implicitly or explicitly modeled on utilitarian calculus or consequentialist calculus. And those of you who have experience in philosophy know that this is a highly controversial theory, philosophically speaking, because it leaves out considerations of justice, fairness, equity, and autonomy. So basically, this formula looks just as in cost-benefit analysis on overall well-being and not on the way risks and benefits, for example, are distributed in society. So it could lead to the exploitation of minorities, for example. Another problem with this formula is that this product of probability and unwanted effect could, for example, mean that we have a high probability of a not so harmful effect and a very low probability of a very, very harmful effect. And as long as the product of these two factors is identical, then on this approach, these two risks would be on a par. Whereas morally speaking, there might be a really substantive difference. For example, because it leaves out considerations of time. It leaves out considerations such as, for example, think about nuclear energy. Often you hear the experts say, oh, people are against nuclear energy, and the next day they step into their own car, and which is a much higher risk of dying, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, so car driving is high probability, comparatively low unwanted effects, so few people involved, of course, horrible if something like that happens, but compared to a nuclear meltdown, nuclear disaster, very, very low probability, but detrimental consequences. So I'm not wanting to make a stance here on nuclear energy, for example, but just to give an example that things are much more complicated than just putting stuff in a mathematical formula, pushing a button, and you get a result. No, there are ethical assumptions entailed in this approach that are not made explicit. People might use them manipulatively or unknowingly. And in both cases, it's definitely not the case that it's rational, objective, and value neutral. Interestingly, very, very fascinating research by the psychologist Paul Slovic, who basically founded the field of risk perception research in psychology, shows that indeed lay people have different risk perceptions than experts. That's not very surprising. That's something that we all can perceive every day in the media. However, while Slovic initially thought, like most people, so the experts got it right and the lay people got it wrong, he started to develop his research over the decades and then started to hypothesize maybe lay people have different connotations with the notion of risk than experts. So he designed his psychometric studies in a more and more fine-grained way, and he found out that indeed, when given, for example, a questionnaire, how do you rank the risk of, how do you rank the probability of annual fatalities of this technology or activity, the risk perceptions of lay people came very close to those of experts, because basically they were using the expert definition. However, when Slovic and his colleagues just used the notion of risk without the official definition attached to it, then indeed the risk perceptions of lay people differed from those of lay experts. So apparently lay people have different connotations with the notion of risk than experts. And it turned out after many studies, which you can read about in this wonderful book by Paul Slovic, which is a collection of a lot of his papers on this topic, it turns out that they actually came up with a list of 18 additional considerations that play a role in lay people's risk perceptions. And a lot of them are very similar to those shared by philosophers in the context of cost-benefit analysis. So lay people care about fairness of distribution, about whether risk is taken on based on free decision-making, whether there are available alternatives, et cetera, all kinds of ethical issues that can be justified on philosophical grounds. I've written a paper where I went through all these 18 considerations and argued that, first of all, that most philosophical theories actually, or a lot of very well-known philosophical theories support these considerations that lay people implicitly, intuitively have when they evaluate risks, and that they're either missing from the official quantitative approaches, or it's not really easy to see how one could actually incorporate them in them. So interestingly, there's consensus by philosophers, psychologists, social scientists more broadly, and even the broader public, that the standard definition of risk is too narrowly defined, that we should broaden the definition of risk. So far so good. This could be a happy story. And I think it's not very often that all these different parties agree. And I could leave it here, but this is actually where my story starts to get, for me, even more exciting. So, because what about the emotions? So far, I've just talked about ethical considerations and risk perceptions and Slovik's work on risk perception. I haven't mentioned his work on risk and emotion yet, which came later. And basically, what comes out from this work is that emotions such as fear, for example, are an important factor in lay people's risk perceptions. And one of the most outspoken scholars on risk and emotion, against risk and emotion, is Kahan, who everybody probably knows by now from his work on nudging, but he also wrote on fear and risk, and he argues that risk emotions are irrational, leading to disproportional policy measures, and he argues that we should follow rational methods such as cost-benefit analysis. Basically, the fact that emotions play such an important part in risk perception seem to complicate the previous nice, smooth story that lay people's risk perceptions show a broader, more ethically complex and well-grounded view of risk. And Slovik actually also argues along these lines. So he says we should correct risk as feeling by risk as analysis based on quantitative methods. Hey, that's really surprising. That really kind of contradicts the previous work. What a shame. So this was the kind of work that started, to trigger me to do philosophical research on risk and emotion specifically. And to make my argument as difficult as possible for myself, let me provide you with additional evidence that would actually shed light on make emotions in the context of risk very suspicious. So more in general, in empirical moral psychology research, dominant views are, for example, by Joshua Green, Jonathan Haidt, whose work is well known. They've argued that irrational emotions, according to them, irrational emotions and gut reactions determine our moral views, and rationality works post hoc. So when we think that we give a rational ethical argument, we're actually, according to Jonathan Haidt, only defending a viewpoint that our gut reactions pre-rationally already have determined for us. So that's why there's this famous paper about the rational tail that is backed by the emotional dog. So we just think we're rational, but actually we're not. And Green has this work on putting people in fMRI scanners and then seeing that utilitarian judgments are made by rational parts of the brain, deontological judgments are made by emotional parts of our brains, and he concludes from that of course, given that emotions are bad, utilitarian judgment is better. I have, of course, lots of objections against this, but let me first make my story even more hard for me to defend. So then there's this work by Dan Kahan on cultural cognition, also in the context of risk. His work has been very important also now in the light of all things happening in the United States, people being in their own bubbles, confirming the kind of views that they already have when they read the news, for example. And Kahan already did research about this about 10 years ago, from which it turns out that depending on one's cultural, moral, and political outlook, people are more concerned about either, for example, safety risks or security risks. And people trust the experts that fit their own political profile. And it's hard to break through and overcome these barriers. So these pictures I borrowed from Dan Kahan's work. He's maybe you know Cultural Theory by Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildavsky, and he has combined that with psychometric work on risk. And Douglas and Wildavsky had these 2 dimensions, hierarchical political views and egalitarian views versus, and then the other dimension is individualist versus communitarian approaches. And Kahan and his colleagues, they've created fake experts. These are the corresponding pictures, and they created little profiles, and they all have written books with high impact publishers, and they all work at Ivy League universities. And then, unsurprisingly, this person argues that climate change is the greatest threat for humanity, and this person argues that terrorism is the greatest risk for humanity. And then in the study, they first let people fill in a survey to determine where the research subjects in which quadrant they basically fall. And then they present them with one of these experts, or 2 of these experts, opposing experts, and then they ask, who of these experts is the most trustworthy according to you? And then people indeed trust the expert that fits more or less their profile. Of course, they're not aware that it's all plotted like this. But this is basically the result. So this kind of work explains why some people only know the evidence by climate skeptics, and some people only listen to the evidence by climate experts who confirm climate change, and why, for example, confronting somebody with the scientific evidence for climate change, they would say, well, there's this one author and who's written climate skeptical work, and that's the author, that's the really serious scholar. This can basically be explained along these lines. And apparently when you mix up these profiles and make them less predictable, that's when people start to change their views, which is, of course, as Kahan himself also says, is ethically, of course, dubious in real life settings. And it turns out if you confront people with all kinds of different positions, that's the most likely that people actually converge and are able to come out of their bubble and change their views. So this is really an argument for genuine deliberation, taking on different viewpoints. But it's very hard. How can you do that? And then, of course, there's this very, very influential work by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, Thinking Fast and Slow. I guess most people by now have heard about this work. So it's basically about these 2 systems with which we process information. System 1, which is supposedly intuitive, affective, and fast. And evolutionary prior helps us navigate smoothly through a complex world, but comes at the price of being highly fallible. Then there's system 2, which is supposed to be rational, analytical, reflective, and occurred later in our evolution, and it's normatively superior to system 1. And Kahneman argues that system 2 is the lazy system. It costs much more energy and resources to activate it and to really engage in complex, rational, abstract thinking. That's why we're so tempted to rely on this spontaneous system in everyday life. And there's a lot of fascinating evidence for this. But of course, the question is whether we can generalize from these specific studies to all kinds of decision making. And also you see that this is similar to the common dichotomy between emotion versus reason, which we know from philosophy for centuries. So first of all, so in my book that Professor Hare kindly mentioned, I analyze some of the empirical evidence here, and I argue that in some cases where these supposed biases by system 1, then it's far from clear that these are really biases of emotion. So that's one problem. Then in some cases it's not clear that the example really shows a bias. There's also fascinating work by the German psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer, who also questions some of the examples by Kahneman and others and says, well, actually the supposedly irrational response can actually very well be justified. But then specifically I have problems with generalizing from these examples about processing statistics to emotion and rationality in general, which is what Kahneman and others do, and also Slovic, for example, in the context of risk and emotion. Because next to this interesting, illuminating framework on dual process theory, there's also other research on emotions, which surprisingly is hardly ever mentioned in research on risk on emotion by psychologists and social scientists who mainly base their work on dual process theory. Now, those of you who have attended more of these lectures or work on emotion in other contexts are aware that there are other theories of emotions that are not as dichotomous as this System 1, System 2 framework. Philosophers and psychologists have argued, actually for centuries, millennia, that emotions are needed for practical rationality. Philosophers as Nussbaum, Soderman, Bob Roberts, they have argued for the practical wisdom that we acquire through the emotions and the narrative structure of emotions. For example, Paul Slovic and his colleagues exposed people to a time pressure condition lasting 5.2 seconds, and then the control group had more time to assess risks. The different groups made different rankings of risks. And they claim that the people in the time pressure condition used affect or emotion or System 1, and the people in the non-time pressure condition made rational judgments. But there's really no clear evidence that we can distinguish emotional states from rational states by putting a timer of 5.2 seconds. To the contrary, I hope, for example, that our love for our loved ones lasts longer than 5.2 seconds, just to mention a trivial emotion, just as love, maybe the most important emotion, and think about moral emotions such as shame, guilt. I mean, probably when we feel these emotions, we would wish they would be away after 5.2 seconds, but they're not. They have a narrative structure. They usually maybe fade out when we made amends and apologize, but maybe then still we feel residual guilt and shame, for example. This is not captured by such a very static model. And then there's this really fascinating research by the neuropsychologist Antonio Damasio on people with brain defects to their amygdala. These people lose their capacity to feel emotions, but in some cases the IQ is unaffected because the brain damage is very local. Now you might think, well, these people are the perfect rational decision makers, right? They don't have emotions anymore and they still have the same IQ as before their accident or illness. Well, it turns out that these people lose their capacity to make practical judgments. What should I eat for dinner tonight? But also moral judgments. How should I treat my peers? How should I treat other human beings? These people also still know abstractly that we shouldn't steal, lie, kill, etc., but in concrete circumstances where we have to make contextual moral judgments, making difficult trade-offs between all kinds of conflicting values and treating people in a subtle way, these people lose that capacity. So it seems like we have really strong evidence that although, of course, emotions can have lots of problems, point taken, without emotions we would be in even deeper problems. And a lot of these theories also argue that emotions are not only affective states, like maybe pure gut reactions maybe, they also have a cognitive component. So again, take the feeling of guilt or the emotion of guilt. In English, there's this nice expression, feeling the pangs of guilt. But feeling guilty also involves that I have this judgment or belief that I did something wrong. It's not a purely rational state. If somebody would say, I know that I did something wrong, but I don't feel bad about it, we would say, you don't really get it. You don't grasp the full meaning of guilt. On the contrary, if somebody would say, I feel so guilty, even though I know that I didn't do anything wrong, we would say, well, this is maybe a form of pathological guilt or maybe reasonable or explainable guilt, as in the case of survival guilt, for example. I don't want to trivialize any of these emotions, but it's not paradigmatic guilt where the cognition and the feeling, the emotion go hand in hand. And so there are some theories of emotion that say, for example, by Bob Roberts, that the paradigmatic emotions have the cognitive and the affective aspect in an inseparable way. They really belong together. So it's not even a temporal sequence or a causal sequence. They're two sides of the same coin. And of course, all these separate states can also exist, but it's important to acknowledge, I think, to be aware that there are also these integrated states. So it seems that emotions have features of system 1 and system 2. So emotions seem to fall into both systems or neither. So we could talk about system 3, or maybe just stop talking about these systems, because maybe they're not separate systems anyway. It's maybe a gradual thing, and emotions can fall somewhere on the spectrum. And so this other view of emotions opens up intellectual space with direct practical consequences. First of all, generally in meta-ethics, I've argued that moral emotions and intuitions are an indispensable source of ethical insight. They allow for direct moral perception and the attention for specific context, so exactly what the Damasio patients lack, as I mentioned. And in German, which is actually my native language, we have this beautiful word, Fingerspitzengefühl. So it's this fine-grained sensitivity. There's also a lot of research on expert judgment, for example, and internalized knowledge, so that you develop by experience and practice. And of course, there's this link with the Phronimous and Aristotelian virtue ethics. And so these emotions and intuitions help us to assess different cases. I've argued for this in general, and in this book that I co-edited with Kahan with beautiful contributions by lots of philosophers who are partially also part of the series, Michael Layswing, for example. They've all written on these various beautiful aspects of the emotions. So in my work, I've then also argued for this role of emotions in the context of risky technologies. So I argue that emotions, moral emotions, such as sympathy, but also fear, which is not paradigmatically a moral emotion, but it can be a morally relevant emotion because it can involve moral judgments about a threat to something that is valuable and important. Indignation, enthusiasm, so also positive emotions, of course, can point to morally salient aspects of technology, such as risks, but also benefits, autonomy and fairness, so exactly the kinds of ethical considerations that are left out of the technocratic quantitative approach that do play a role in lay people's risk judgments. But then my additional point is, this is not in tension with the fact that lay people also are largely emotional in risk perception. Actually, I hypothesize that this is the reason why lay people have this richer understanding of risk, because emotions play a role in their perception of risk, so that allows for these additional considerations to come in. Of course, that's a partially an empirically testable claim, and I'm very glad that we are currently collaborating with some empirical psychologists from Groningen University, where we try to really empirically test this in experimental studies, but also in some surveys to see whether this is actually indeed something we can also empirically show. So just to make sure, of course, I'm not saying that emotions are infallible. To the contrary, just as all other human capacities, they can lead us astray. Let that be clear. However, I think that without emotions, it would be even worse. Emotions make a very important contribution to ethical decision making in general, but also specifically in the context of risk. Still, of course, we need to have quantitative scientific information about risky technologies. That's without any doubt. However, whereas that information is necessary for ethical decision making about risky technologies, it's not sufficient. So we need the scientific information, but that in itself doesn't render us with ethical judgments. We need moral thinking to come to an ethical judgment. And then on my theory, moral thinking actually also involves moral feeling. So Sunstein, in this book that I mentioned, argues that emotions lead to what he calls probability neglect. So for example, if somebody's scared of flying, you can read as many statistics as you like about how safe flying is. You could still experience this fear of flying. So your emotion lets you ignore probabilities. So this is a possible pitfall of the emotions. So here we need to be informed by magnitudes, information about magnitudes and science, et cetera, probably in an emotionally accessible way. But in order to what I would like to call complexity neglect, so to really be aware of the moral complexity of decision-making about risky technologies, we need more than just these simple mathematical formula. We also need to include ethical thinking, and here decisions about risks have to be informed by moral emotions. This is, by the way, the book that just came out with Routledge, just in case you're interested, in which I argue all these things in a very detailed way. This was the main theoretical framework. Now I would like to mention a few aspects of decision-making about risky technologies where this framework can shed light on, and then I will come to the artworks. So what about the experts? Why do only lay people have emotions? Of course they don't. It's also experts have emotions. It's not only lay people. However, I think in the past, one used to train engineers, for example, and policymakers in a way that they should ban emotions from decision making and risk assessment. And this was thought to be a good idea. Now, first of all, one can wonder whether indeed scientists make their decisions in an unemotional way. And a philosopher at Leiden University, James McAllister, has written beautiful work on the role of emotion and aha experiences in scientific discovery, for example. But also when it comes to ethical reflection about new technologies, I think emotions of experts are very important. Interestingly, there's this empirical study from, by now, already 10 years ago by Schäufele and others, that in the case of nanotechnology, experts were more worried about their own technology than the public. Now, partially that might have been due back then that most lay people have never heard about nanotechnology. I'm not sure how much that's the case these days. But in any case, it's interesting that the experts are worried about the technology they themselves are developing. And so on the traditional ideal of the engineer and the scientist to be this unemotional, purely rational person, where these emotions should not have played a role in the work of the scientists and engineers, I actually argue in another paper that experts should take their emotional concerns seriously in the design of risky technologies. Why? Because they're at the cradle of these new developments. They have the capacity to think about these ethical issues before other people are even aware that this technology might come into existence. And so one of the important approaches that we have developed at TU Delft is what we call front-loading ethics, so not coming up with ethical considerations after the technologies then say it's all bad, we should never have done it. No, we should actually think about the ethical aspects of new technological developments while the technology is developed. So we call this responsible innovation, which is now also a major theme in European research funding. And the idea is that technologies bring us a lot of fantastic things for society. We are not the kind of ethicists who say technology is all wrong and bad. However, most technologies also have their downsides and risks. So in order to make sure that we develop the technology in a way that addresses ethical issues and optimizes what is good for society, what is good for people's well-being and fair and just and respecting autonomy, we should think about these ethical issues from the start. So that's why we have a number of projects where we do so-called ethical parallel research, so where ethicists collaborate with engineers and work with them together and reflect about ethical aspects from the start. But given, again, that these experts are also moral beings with moral emotions, they should also actively bring in their moral concerns even if, or maybe exactly because they are partially revealed by their emotions in the design and the reflection about the technologies they develop. And then, of course, there's the public there, the stakeholders. And so there are a lot of approaches these days in social sciences and design theorizing about co-creation and stakeholder involvement. And to this, I would like to add that, yes, indeed, we should co-create these new technological developments. But here as well, there should be room for emotional and moral concerns. So we shouldn't expect the lay people to be trained to become proto-experts, rather acknowledge that they bring in a different perspective and value that in itself, even if the concerns are grounded in emotions, because those might reveal values after all. This puts experts and lay people on equal footing, takes away polarization, and opens the way for genuine dialogue. And I think a very nice example for this is about nuclear waste disposal site in Belgium, in Mol, which was a project that was co-developed with a sociologist from the University of Antwerp, Anne Bergmans. And they involved the local population in decision-making about the relatively short-term nuclear waste. And we spoke, one of the governmental committees that I'm part of, we spoke to the people from the nuclear waste organization, and the director of this organization was a nuclear physicist. I asked him, so were you just sending to the local population, or did you also listen to them? In other words, what did you learn from them? And he said, everything. He said we came up with a completely different design, and it was much better than anything we could have thought of ourselves. So, and it's not because the local population existed of nuclear experts. No, it was because they brought in different perspectives and different considerations. This project didn't focus explicitly on emotions, but it shows the power of co-design and bringing on different perspectives. The new Dutch risk policy, so in the past, for example, in the Netherlands, the risk policy was very technocratic. Then they developed a more populist approach where they said, well, emotions are irrational, but people are emotional. Let's just take this for granted and go with the will of the public. And in 2014, they launched a new risk policy, and they included emotions and values as a main consideration, as one of the 10 main considerations. And I'm happy that I could make a modest contribution here. So here you see that there's a direct link between meta-ethical, deeply philosophical considerations and very, very practical applications that can have major impact on society. And of course, this is just a happy story. Of course, there can be lots of problems. So but first, let me just wrap up a little bit here about. I mentioned the two pitfalls in the beginning, right? The technocratic pitfall, the populist pitfall, I already mentioned. There are also deliberative approaches to decision-making about risky technologies, but these are also couched in a rationalist account on moral deliberation. I think that we should actually have emotional deliberation, so we should revise these participatory risk assessment approaches by including emotions and taking emotions as a starting point of the discussion. So it doesn't mean that we stop there. We should start with the emotions and then deliberate about them and reflect whether they reveal important moral insights or not. And that reflection will also still involve emotions. Well, how? So, for example, emotions can be misguided. Again, I don't want to deny that, of course. However, where a lot of these scholars that I mentioned before, like Haidt and Kahneman and Slovic and others, just focus on emotional states as gut reactions that are irrational or not cognitive. I argue that emotions can also be reflective. They can provide us with the possibility of a shifting point of view. So by sympathizing with another person, understanding their narrative, their point of view, their story, their emotions, I can maybe appreciate the totally different viewpoint much, much better than I would initially have thought. So I think we should keep talking, even when it's from people from the other bubble. Also, emotions can let us to care for the well-being of others, and in that way also broaden our own often very narrow point of view. And again, Michael Leiswing, who has been here or will come here, he has written very beautiful work on how emotions, second-order emotions as it were, can help us assess first-order emotions. How do I feel about my own emotions? Maybe I feel disgusted about something, but maybe I feel guilty about being disgusted about it. And so that engages us in this reflection. You can have probably many, many levels there, and that's when the real reflection is going on. There's interesting work by Robert Frank, an economist, about how altruistic emotions can help overcome egoistic emotions, for example, in prisoner dilemma cases, which is also relevant, for example, for issues like climate change. Now, this sounds easy, using emotions and then critically reflect on our other emotions. But of course, this can be very, very difficult. And now I think this is where artworks can play a role. And now you might think, oh my gosh, Sabine, you first you introduce values and something as technical, so then you introduce emotions, and now you introduce art. Yes, I do indeed. I do think that artworks can help us externalize certain emotional or ethical considerations and making them more explicit, and thereby facilitating moral reflection. And of course, also that is not a foolproof method, let that be clear. I don't think there is a foolproof method. I don't think there is a silver bullet to solve debates about risky technologies. So I think it's going to be a messy, complicated issue. But I think given how depressing a lot of our previous debates about risky technologies have gone, which were democratically lacking, wanting, and maybe have led sometimes to dismissing a technology that could have been good for society if developed in a responsible way. I think we need different ways to reflect about risky technologies. And indeed, as I will show in a moment, there are more and more artists working on and with risky technologies. But first, why this idea in the first place? But I think that art can play a very important role for our moral reflection. For example, in the case of literature, narratives can broaden our perspective. They can let us sympathize with others. They can lead us to formative experiences where we take on a very different viewpoint just by having taken on the first-person viewpoint of someone with whom we thought we could never, ever sympathize. And a person we probably would have avoided in real life, but in this novel we were drawn into the perspective of this person. And literature and film, for example, can be seen as arenas to train and expand our moral emotions. And this is, of course, an idea that Martha Nussbaum most prominently has defended in her beautiful work. But this has not really been studied, this idea, in a philosophical way in the context of risky technologies. So this is what I propose in the next minutes. So technology-related literature, for example, these iconic dystopian novels, Frankenstein, 1984, Brave New World, probably novels we've all read or at least watched the movies. Then more recent novels by major writers who write general kind of novels, but also have written on genetic modification, such as Kazuo Ishiguro, of course, just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Michel Houellebecq. And then, of course, we have a whole genre, science fiction literature, and Isaac Asimov and I, Robot developed these laws of robotics about how robots and humans should interact with each other. There's climate literature, so this Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I've started to read it, but very depressing in terms of emotions, so still have to work my way through it. This is one of the challenges, of course, that sometimes these emotional experiences are not always bright, but they help us in this critical reflection. And then there's also visual techno-art, as I call it. So, for example, the bio-artist Stellaric, who through surgery attached an additional artificial I think, in a petri dish grown ear on his arm that actually has an internet connection implanted to it. Eduardo Koch developed this fluorescent rabbit alba through genetic modification. Just to give a few examples, there are festivals, events, and competitions for techno artists. Actually, at this very moment, there's an event taking place in Amsterdam at Waag Society, which is a very, very interesting institute where they have an open wet lab, etc. And they do a lot of projects with artists and techno scientists. So actually, there are a lot of artists working on these issues. For example, Anna Dumitriou, who just has an exhibit at the Science Museum in Science History Museum in Oxford at this very moment, and she's in Amsterdam at that Waag Society event. There are visual artists working on climate art, which is partially also a technology, like the Tidal Lagoon project by Cape Farewell. There's this award-winning building of the Dutch nuclear waste organization COVRA. So the former director of the COVRA is a lover of art, and he met a local artist, William Verstraeten, that chatted about art. Actually, they store historical artworks and pieces from the Netherlands colonial past amongst the nuclear waste, because the museum, the local museum there, doesn't have enough space for the artworks, and they need exactly the same kind of stability and light and humidity and temperature as nuclear waste. So this former director offered, Hans Corré is his name, to store artworks amongst the nuclear, vessels with nuclear waste, which is really fascinating to see. But he's really a genuine lover of art, so he asked this local artist, William Verstraeten, could you maybe design some artworks for the interior of the building? William Verstraeten actually eventually did that, but William Verstraeten said, could you give me a model of the building just to get an idea? And they gave him this model of this gray concrete block. And then a few weeks later, William Verstraeten came back with this orange, brightly orange painted model, and this is how they indeed then designed the building. So it's painted in bright orange with in contrasting green, Einstein's formula on one side of the building, Heisenberg's formula on the other side of the building. And the building will be painted in, so every time it needs to be repainted, which is normal with a painted building, they will paint it in more and more fading shades of orange to symbolize nuclear radioactive decay. And so I think this building beautifully lets us to think about all these aspects of nuclear technology. It's not taking a stance pro or anti-nuclear. It's really letting us reflect about this. And we had a nuclear scientist from Berkeley visiting us a few years ago, and he said, wow, in most countries this would be hidden away somewhere that nobody could see it. And here this is really, when you pass by, you really have to see it. I have to admit, it's in a very remote area in the Netherlands, so you really have to take an effort to see it, but it's really worth seeing it. It won an architecture prize, so very interesting. And so, for example, the fluorescent rabbit, I think there's even some debate whether it ever existed or whether it was just a hoax, and I read that Eduardo Koch actually said that the debate about the existence of that rabbit in itself is a conceptual artwork. And of course, you know, maybe some of these artworks like this, maybe it's annoying, this is so decadent, what is this weird idea, and is it really even an artwork, or is it just, you know, a big show? But all these emotions, even when they're more on a meta level, they make us think about these technologies. And for example, Anna Dumitriou's work, she's really playing with the aesthetic properties of bacteria, for example. So it's really fascinating work. So in other words, there's so much work going on in visual arts, but also in literature. Actually, and I forgot the name of the writer, I just wanted to look it up again. I think it was Amitav Ghosh, I forgot. A famous writer said a few weeks ago, he wrote a book about the fact that most writers don't write about these new technological developments, and that's really a shame. This should be something that should be at the core of what writers are concerned about: climate change, technological developments. I totally agree, and I think that philosophers should write about these artworks, and I think actually more philosophers should write about these risky technologies given their impact on society. However, as is the case right now, there are not a lot of philosophers of technology. I think most of them are in the Netherlands. But specifically when it comes to these works of techno-art, I don't think there's really any research by philosophers on these artworks. There's, of course, again, this wonderful work by Martha Nussbaum, several books about the role of art for emotional reflection. But it's work by philosophers on art and emotion is mainly on interpersonal relationships, for example, or political issues maybe, but not on specifically on technological risks, even though there are all these interesting developments in art going on these days. There's sociological and historical research on techno-art, which sometimes touches on philosophical issues, but of course the approach is more from media studies or art history, for example. So it doesn't really, this kind of work doesn't really address pressing philosophical and normative questions. And some of these questions are, for example, how do these works of techno-art and their impact on moral emotions compare with abstract ethical theorizing? In other words, do these artworks really help us to engage in more profound ethical reflection? I think they do, but of course that's something we should really explore in more detail. And of course, some of these artworks might also lead us completely astray. How do these artworks compare with other contexts? So these other artworks that have traditionally been studied by philosophers that reflect more on human relationships, for example. Can we use the same frameworks on art and emotion, or should we expand them and include very different considerations? And then what's the link between aesthetic, reflective, and affective aspects and impacts of artworks? So maybe an artwork that is conceptually brilliant might not be aesthetically or artistically very challenging and contributing. Or the other way around, beautiful picture, but does it really help us to think critically? And does it really help us in emotional reflection? And that already hints on the next question, because that almost sounds like we should use art in an instrumental way, but doesn't that contradict the autonomy of art? And isn't paradoxically the usefulness of art that it doesn't really serve a purpose from the start at least? So it's more an indirect side effect or so, which all sounds much too instrumental and too deterministic. So here's an interesting tension, I think. So if we invite artists to play a role in public debates, how can we avoid that they're instrumentally used? So I think one of the issues is here that we should, when we give artists an assignment, make clear that they are free to develop the artworks to their own understanding and liking, whatever, and preferences. And we probably should also invite different artists to shed light on different aspects of a technology to avoid that it's just going to be a nice new tool to market a technology, for example. What are the moral responsibilities of techno artists? So they should have some freedom, but do they also have moral responsibilities? For example, should they really understand the technology well enough to do justice to the real aspects of the technology, to not just sketch a picture of it that really influences public debate, but really mischaracterizes the technology. And also when it comes, for example, to involving the experience of viewers in the experience of the artwork, should artists maybe obey certain rules of scientific and research integrity, given that they're playing or working with technologies that can be strictly regulated? For example, in the context of biotechnology, we have regulations for working with genetically modified substances or genetic modification. Can artists just do whatever they want because they are so free and autonomous, or should they be bound by exactly the same rules and regulations as scientists because in the end the risks will be the same, or should they even obey stricter rules because their work is less useful for society? 2.5 years ago I was in a panel organized by a project from Waag Society, Trust Me, I'm an Artist, very nice project. It was at a festival in Berlin, and they had this artist Howard Bolland, who had initially worked with stem cells of hearts of rats to create little propellers. And this led to, I saw there's a little YouTube video, a beautiful poetic image, but he was working in a lab with scientists, and then he thought, well, these scientists, you know, they have to go through all these strict procedures which don't exist for artists yet, but they are working on saving human lives. I'm just playing with stuff. So he actually, given that there are no regulations yet for artists, at least not as systematic as for scientists, he imposed some ethical barriers for himself, and then instead of the initial artwork, went for an experiment with human sperm cells, using his own sperm cells, and then it all ended in a race between his own male sperm cells, and it was a criticism on masculinity. And for me, it was actually talking about the aesthetic qualities of the maybe ethically less controversial artwork were less than the initial one with the heart cells, which of course is ethically much more contentious. So here are some issues on moral responsibilities and rights and legal restrictions and ethical restrictions on artists working with these technologies. To my knowledge, there are no frameworks for this yet. And given that there are so many artists working with these technologies, I think this is very important. Then what are strengths and weaknesses? This again sounds very quantitative and like it's an easy thing to just measure these things of different forms of techno-art. So maybe literature appeals more to our narrative emotions, taking us into the point of view of another person, and in that sense appealing to some kind of moral emotions that make really help us in critical thinking, whereas maybe visual artworks appeal more to very visceral experiences that are much more direct and experiential, but also in that sense give rise to reflection, but probably this works out in very different ways. So this would involve in-depth study of artworks and philosophical reflection on those. I'm still hoping to one day get a big research grant on this. So far, I haven't succeeded in this. I'm going for Plan E next year. So hopefully, finally, I will get some research funding to really have some PhD students and postdocs studying this together with me. In any case, to conclude, so far my hypothesis, which hopefully I can test to the extent that you can test a philosophical theory, but examine further with hermeneutical studies and maybe some interviews with experiences of stakeholders. I think my hypothesis is that artworks can enhance or contribute to emotional moral reflection on risks. Of course, they can also maybe bias our experiences, but I think there's this potential that hasn't been really investigated yet that we should look into. Because art can make abstract problems, for example, more concrete, explore new scenarios, challenge the imagination, and broaden narrow personal perspectives through empathy, sympathy, and compassion. And I think one additional feature that art can give us here is in philosophy of technology and sociology of technology in the 1980s, somebody wrote about the so-called Coleridge dilemma, that either you start reflecting about a technology when it's already developed and it's too late, it's already let out into society, or if you think about it from the start, you never know whether it really would develop this in this way. So basically either too early or too late, you can't really solve this. And I think that artworks can play a role here because they can take the technology out of the lab and bring it into the public sphere. Now you might say, well, public sphere, come on, people go to the museum, that's a small elite. Well, first of all, in Britain, the wonderful thing is that museums are, I think, still for free admission, so it's much more accessible than in many other countries. And also, I think there's still people are more likely to go to a museum than to visit the lab of a scientist. So, and also these artworks don't need to be restricted to museums and galleries. They can be part of festivals or other public spaces where people can really engage with these artworks. So in other words, these artworks could make a modest contribution to overcoming this Coleridge dilemma by already anticipating possible technological developments as well as the impact they could have on society by having these exemplary works that engage imaginatively with possible future scenarios and let us already think about them before they have manifested, like with these dystopian novels that I mentioned. These were developed before these technologies ever got so realistic as they are now, actually. So, in other words, to wrap up, I think that art can contribute to emotional moral reflection about the kind of society we might want to live in, also including risky technologies. Thank you very much.